ending slaved by others. The Sudra represents, therefore, a person who, regardless of wealth, regardless of station, regardless of opportunity, goes from the cradle to the grave with no interest in the well-being of anyone except himself and his own. The individual to whom selfishness is a way of life, because selfishness is a supreme form of ignorance. The man who does not go to school may be learned. The man who is selfish is always ignorant. So these situations, taken literally, became more or less ridiculous. But lifted up to their level of principles, they had truths that are useful even in our day. Now, in the ancient system of thinking, we know that Buddhism, coming in, had as its purpose a transforming of certain East Indian symbolism into what later became Buddhist symbolism. The Buddhists did not destroy the gods of the Hindus, nor turn against them, nor declare them to be untrue or unreasonable. The Buddhist point of view was that these gods of the Hindus were not gods at all, except by man's appointment. He created them in the image of himself and bestowed most of his own virtues and vices upon his deities. These were attitudes, these were opinions, these were misinterpretations of principles. But the principles themselves, if they could be cleared, would be very noble and beautiful. It was just a case where, as the Buddhist point of view takes it, it was necessary to convert the gods of India and make Buddhists out of them. Make Buddhas out of the gods of India. Now, it was considered to be a little tricky, but it happened so smoothly, so gently, that it was merely a matter of deepening meanings. There was no conflict, really, between the conversion of the Hindu to Buddhism in the ancient time. He could accept it or not as he pleased. It wasn't important. But gradually, out of this situation, there rose a new estimation of the principles and purposes of deities. That these deities were in reality very much like the great aristocrats of the material world. Today we have a tendency to regard with great veneration the leaders we ourselves have created. We open the door for the advancing politician. We have great respect for our leaders, for our actors, for our school teachers, for all classes of persons that we have created, and we have tremendous respect for the wealth. Wealth becomes a kind of honorary degree in the life of everyone who gains it. So we take a very humble position in the presence of wealth, very seldom questioning how the wealthy person got it, or what he's going to do with it, or the trouble he's having with it himself. These things pass lightly. Now, in the Indian system, the old Vedic gods became more or less man-created aristocrats. They were based upon principles that were true. But in the course of time, the believers limited and narrowed down the qualities and attributes of their deities, changing embodied principles into personalities. It was part of the purpose of Buddhism to reverse this motion and to restore what it originally was intended to be, that all deities, like all mortals, are servants of truth, that the supreme purpose of the deity is the improvement of his creation, that he must be constant and continuously mindful of the needs of the creatures over which he has temporary government. These deities were therefore the Maharajas, the world kings, and they were honored and recognized. But Buddhism was a little leery of them. It recognized also that the tendency of the world king was to create more and more temporal empire. He wanted larger kingdoms. He wanted to conquer his neighbors. And while claiming to be a good Buddhist or claiming to be a devout Hindu, he went out and made war upon his brothers. These things Buddhism recognized as deficiencies due to lack of one important factor, namely that true religion is an internal experience. And without this internal experience, nearly everything else is inadequate. The term Buddha, of course, it comes from an ancient Sanskrit term, which means enlightened. Therefore, Buddha is not primarily a person, but a state of enlightenment, a condition. Now, the same might be true also if we consider the Western philosophies and religions. We may personify Jesus Christ, but a Christian has to live the philosophy, live that religion. Christ is perfected in the Christian. And in the East, Buddha is embodied in the person who keeps the rules. Now, the rules are very, very simple, basically, because enlightenment is a condition that arises from a series of changes in the character and conduct of individuals. Therefore, we find the story brought into focus that Surya, the sun god, the god of all light, had a consort in Hinduism who carried the name of Maya. This consort was the feminine aspect of the sun. It was not originally a lunar divinity, but it was simply the transmission of light. It was not something inferior, something secondary, something dependent. It was, for the power that it personified, simply fulfillment. Everything that is right has to be fulfilled. Laws are made, but they must be kept. Knowledge is accumulated, but it must be interpreted in terms of common good. So in the ancient system, Surya, the sun, was the principle of infinite universal light, the light of reality, a light that is very different from just the sunball that we see in the sky. Surya was the light of the world. It was that power which bestowed upon everything that existed not only the power of life, but the power of intelligence, and ultimately the actuality of salvation. In other words, it was the creator, the preserver, and the redeemer. It was the infinite reality upon which all other things depend. It is the light in things that make them live. It is the light in our eyes that makes us read a book correctly. It is light in our heart that gives us love. It is light everywhere that transforms the darkness of ignorance, selfishness, perversity, fear into a radiant internal enlightenment. This means, as even the Western mystics have clearly shown, a change in what man sees when he looks. The individual who is not enlightened looks upon a world of difficulties. The enlightened person looks upon a world in which universal principles are fulfilling themselves, regardless of whether we like it or not. But it is perfectly possible for the individual to enter into an intimate association or comradeship with this light. So in the beginning in this system we have light. And this light becomes the principle which is not visible light, physical light, such as we can see, but a light that transforms the inner life of everything that lives. A light that shines through the darkness of every uncertainty, imperfection, and incompleteness. Now, according to this concept, then, Maya would be this light in manifestation. The light per se is in the sun deity, But this light in manifestation becomes the instrument of the enlightenment of everything that lives. Therefore, Maya is not a secondary power. It is the Shakti is not merely a dependent. It is in this case a principle that can only manifest through an appropriate vehicle. And that appropriate vehicle is creation. And over this creation and all that it possesses and all that it contains is the principle of this one light coming home in everything that lives. Therefore, Maya is the fulfillment of the divine purpose, as that purpose is represented by the eternal maternal principle. In the Indian philosophy, finally, in spite of what we may think to the contrary, if we go back far enough to the roots of the Vedas and the great teachings of India, we find that the eternal space itself, the infinite potential theater for the existence of things, that which is the root of everything and from which everything must come and to which it must return, is a feminine power. This represents the inevitable state of birth and rebirth, both of which are feminine potentials. In this sense, therefore, we see the gradual transmission of this concept of Surya and Maya into the development of Buddhist legendary and lore. This legendary and lore divides abruptly into two schools, the northern and the southern. The southern school is far less florid than the northern. The southern school teaches that the only way that the individual can release himself from the great cycle of responsibilities and escape from the illusion of materiality is by entering holy orders, casting off all worldly possessions and going forth in humility and unworldliness along a path that must lead through the whole of life to death. Only when there is a complete renunciation of all material things can the curse of Mara, the Lord of Illusion, be broken. About the beginning of the Christian era, in the northlands of India, on the borders probably of China, a new branch of Buddhism slowly emerged. This branch undoubtedly emerged because of the impact of the Buddhist principle upon the consciousness of its own believers. There was no inconsistency. There was no misinterpretation. There was simply a new realization of relationships in which it became no longer necessary to assume that the great invisible cause, this eternal life, this infinite light, was tyrannical. There was no reason to assume that reality or truth must be cruel. There was no idea or realization that it was necessary to be punished forever for the sins of the fathers, that there was no hope except by this strange path of renouncing everything, including self. As a result of this change of perspective, the second school, which became the northern school, or the Mahayana, became tremendously important in the growth of Asiatic peoples. One of the simplest examples of this point is the Bodhisattva Avalokitesvara, known in Japan and China as Kannon or Kuan Yin, the goddess of mercy. It began in India as a male being, and early representations of it even in China are androgynous. But gradually it became a new being, for it was suddenly recognized or understood that mercy was strangely a heart aspect, that it was something, therefore, that belonged not to the creative processes, but to the redemption and release of creatures. And in this course of procedure across Asia, this deity became feminine, and is as feminine is recognized